Welcome, everyone, to a special broadcast on NHPR. I'm Laura Kanoy, host of The Exchange, and we're coming to you from Studio D, joined by a live audience here. This hour, we're talking about the tone of American political discourse lately and why some fear it's gotten out of hand. Today's discussion is a collaboration between NHPR and the Live Free or Die Alliance, an organization committed to civil dialogue and harnessing technology to put active citizenship within daily reach. Joining us for this conversation are the Granite State's two U.S. Senators, Republican Judd Gregg and Democrat Jeanne Shaheen. Both have participated in Live Free or Die Alliance webcasts recently, Senator Gregg in February and Senator Shaheen in April. This hour, we bring them together to hear their thoughts on this concept of civil dialogue, what it really means, whether it really is in decline, as some say, and if so, who's responsible. And Senator Gregg, welcome. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Laura, thanks for having us.
And Senator Shaheen, welcome to you too. Thanks for your time.
Nice to be here.
Well, let's define first what we're talking about. Senator Gregg, how do you define civility and, by extension, civil discourse?
Well, I think you've got to define it at a variety of levels, but at the most elementary level, it's just being courteous and having discussions which are thoughtful and are where the intense feelings, although there are always going to be intense feelings in governance, are expressed in a thoughtful and measured way rather than through hyperbole and excess.
What do you think, Senator Shaheen? How would you define it?
Well, I would certainly agree with that, and I would add respectful to that and a willingness to listen to the opposite point of view and to not get personal.
Well, and you used the word, Senator Gregg, intensity, and then let's follow up on that. What's the difference between a passionate argument, because let's say you have really deep concerns, and incivility? Where do you determine that line has been crossed, and who gets to decide that, no, that's not passionate, that's uncivil?
Well, you know, it's not unique to the political process to have intense engagement. In fact, in the Senate, there's a spot where Senator Sumner was caned by the congressman from South Carolina. And we have rules in the Senate now which evolved out of situations like that, which require that all discourse in the Senate be extremely civil. In fact, you can't even address another senator when you're on the floor of the Senate. Most people don't realize that. You have to speak through the chair, the president of the Senate, to speak to another senator. And that's done intentionally to avoid intense confrontations over issues which are felt intently by the membership. So I think the key is, I think Jeanne hit it on the nail on the head, is to listen, you know, express your view and then listen to the other view rather than just express your view and then try to shout over the other view. And that's critical to having a good discussion which leads somewhere versus a discussion where both sides simply make their case and head off into the wilderness.
Well, and I want to ask you, Senator Shaheen, and you, Senator Gregg, as well. I hear you that, you know, the rules of the Senate say you have to be polite, but you know, Senator Shaheen, once you get outside the Senate, you know, cable TV, you know, internet sites, whatever you want. So in that less structured environment, where do you draw the line between I'm Senator Shaheen, I'm making a passionate case for something, and I'm being uncivil or rude?
You know, I try and be civil in all of my public appearances and public role. I think it's important for us as leaders to model that.
It's only when you're talking to Bill that you're not civil. Telling him to take out the garbage.
That's right.
Now.
And you know, as Judd said, when we're on the floor of the Senate, we are very civil. But I think what we've seen is that the dialogue has changed a lot over the last several decades. So when I first got involved in politics, we didn't have cable television, so there was no 24-hour news cycle. And I think that has influenced what's happened to our civility. I think talk radio, not NHPR, obviously, but I think much of talk radio has influenced our civil dialogue in this country. And, you know, I think, again, it's up to all of us to think about how we change that.
Well, and I'm interested in that. Yeah, go ahead, Senator Gregg.
I think our discussions in this country have always been intense. That has, you know, I mean, you look at the political history of this country and what people said about Abraham Lincoln when he was president. It's incredible. The much more vitriolic than you hear today. But I think the point that Gene's making is absolutely true. We now have the megaphone amplified so much. It used to be newspapers, and newspapers were basically very partisan vehicles and were incredibly vicious. But now you have a 24/7 news cycle. You have a news cycle which is dominated by the need to sell, obviously, product, and therefore it appears that the news cycle requires hyperbole, and the person who's shouting the most, who's being the most outrageous, that's the person who's going to get the most attention and thus sell the product that allows the media to be vibrant. And then you have this whole blogosphere world where people who used to have very strong opinions and sometimes were extremely uncivil, you might meet them occasionally at a town meeting, but they didn't have the capacity to amplify their voice and to find other people who agree with them to multiply off of. And the blogosphere has allowed that to happen. Now, the blogosphere has great pluses, but one of the minuses is that it has taken political discourse and reduced it, I believe. And instead of having discussions which are substantive and thoughtful, you get discussions which are hyperbole and a lot of shouting. Because of the media has become so amplified and is so ever-present.
And a byproduct of that, I think, is that the audience tends to listen only to those people who share their point of view. So if you're on the left, you're not usually watching Fox News. And if you're on the right, you're not usually watching MSNBC. So that has then magnified this whole dynamic because people don't really listen to other perspectives and other points of view. And so you can't...
Plus
you're both out here, and you can't ever get to the middle.
The thing that I find most worrisome about it is the discussion has become so marginalized. I mean, you just don't have... Some of these issues are pretty complex. And you don't get into the complexity, you don't get into the subtlety. You just get into the shouted one-liner,
right,
which repeats itself over and over again in an amplified way.
I would like to ask you on this. Journalists sometimes feel like, look, if people didn't like the sensational coverage, if they didn't like the crosstalk type program, they wouldn't watch it, they wouldn't read the blogs. If they truly wanted that civil dialogue, they wouldn't seek out inflammatory websites. So my question for both of you is, and Senator Gregg, you can go first, are people just getting the media coverage that they asked for?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question. We're a market-oriented culture, and what markets the best is hyperbole and outrage, it appears. And, thoughtful, in-depth discussion occurs, and there are shows that do things like that, certainly the Sunday morning shows, but for the most part, I think people want to be entertained. And if you're going to be entertained, it involves some level of exaggeration and extrapolation and hyperbole.
So how do you avoid, Senator Shaheen, feeding into that? I mean, you want to get on the news, but you don't want to be ridiculous.
Listen, I think this discussion this morning is a great example of the fact that there is an audience for civil debate and discussion of issues. I mean, the fact that public radio and public television has as big an audience as it has from across the ideological spectrum is testament to that. And the Live Free or Die Alliance website, I think, is another testament to the interest that people have in finding unfiltered information that can give them the facts about issues. And so I actually believe, while I agree with Judd that at first blush, you could say that people are getting the kind of media they're interested in. On the other hand, when you dig a little deeper, I think you find that there really is an audience for more civil and a greater discussion of issues than people are getting in this country right now.
Senator Gregg, what do you think? How do you become part of the political debate without joining those who are not presenting it in a way that we would find acceptable or civil?
Well, I think Gene and I don't take that approach. I mean, fortunately we represent New Hampshire, and people of New Hampshire don't have to be a hyperbolized person, hyperbolizer to represent New Hampshire. In fact, just the opposite. I think people in New Hampshire want a substantive discussion of the issues, and they want it to be done in a in a thoughtful way and in a very civil way, and that's just been our tradition here. I mean, maybe it's a function of our size, the fact that we are a small state, that we're a very well-educated state, and a very sophisticated state politically because of our primary process. But also, I just sense that in this state, there's not a whole lot of toleration for what we're seeing is a national atmosphere of outrage and expression of outrage in a way that isn't civil. So I just think it's a stylistic thing that we have here in New Hampshire. Maybe it's our Yankee roots and our cold winters, but we're really not as hot-headed as some other places.
Well, I often say,
and I think it also speaks to what you said, the primary process. Every 4 years we have an opportunity to engage with the top levels of politics in this country. We have town meeting. We have elections for everybody every 2 years. So there is an opportunity for people who have concerns to engage with their political leaders in a way here that you can't do in a place like California or New York.
That's absolutely true. And you got to remember, this is a tone that's been set in this state for years. I see Governor Peterson in the front row here. I mean, nobody set this tone better than Governor Peterson did. I mean, it's just a tone we've always had. Now, we've had some pretty intense engagements, as Governor Peterson knows, within our primary process, especially internally within our primary process and between the parties. But still, we've always maintained an atmosphere of maturity around issues that I think is sort of unique and sort of nice, actually.
Well, let me remind you that this is a special broadcast on New Hampshire Public Radio with New Hampshire's 2 U.S. senators on the topic of civil discourse in American politics. We have a live audience here in Studio D, and because this is a special presentation, we're not taking any phone calls. We do have a couple questions, though, from our audience that I'll be sharing with you in just a moment. Today's discussion is a collaboration between NHPR and the Live Free or Die Alliance. To find out more about the Alliance, go to livefreeordiealliance.com. Here's a couple questions from our audience that have come in, and you've sort of addressed this one, but I'm interested in a little bit more. Senator Shaheen, I'll give it to you. Is New Hampshire's political culture more civil or less civil than elsewhere in the country? Why? You addressed that somewhat, Senator Gregg, but what do you think, Senator Shaheen? I often say you've got to be nice to somebody because he might be coaching your kid's soccer team next year.
Well, again, I think we haven't seen the kind of outbursts in the last year here that we've seen in some other parts of the country, and I think it speaks to what Judd and I were both saying earlier, that is that there is a level of engagement here that reaches down into the smallest communities where people can engage with their town leaders at town meeting, with their state legislators. We have real representative democracy here. People are always amazed when I talk about the New Hampshire legislature and they find out how many people we have in our legislature, and we have one for every 3,500 people or so. And that gives people the ability to comment and to weigh in when there's an issue that they're concerned about, and I think that's really important.
But it doesn't just run within the political system. I mean, it runs in the social network and in the way the communities work. Take, for example, the way we approach environmental issues in the state. We've never had the strident confrontation that you see in other states in New Hampshire. Our environmental approach has always been consensus. It's always had all the stakeholders at the table. The society really has played a huge role in making that possible. But even the most contentious issues, like putting the road through the Franconia Notch, which took about 15 years of confrontation over how we would do it, were resolved in a non-confrontational way. And I just think it's the culture. I think it's something that we've built in this state as a culture, and it can be lost. You can lose this type of culture very quickly, I think. But so far we've been able to reinforce it, and that's been very constructive to us.
Well, one thing that you do hear people talk about is more of a nationalizing, though, of our politics. That, all politics is local is getting to be less and less the case. That people are just taking scripts from the national parties and inserting the word New Hampshire and Granite State. The heads of both the state Democratic and Republican Party, as you both know, are pretty fiery people. What are your thoughts on that, Senator Sheen, and then Senator Gregg, on whether some of this national vitriol is coming into the Granite State? We certainly do hear some of the same lines used nationally here in New Hampshire.
Well, I think we have seen more partisanship in our state legislature and state government than existed when I first joined the state Senate. When Judd was governor, we worked very closely together, Republicans and Democrats, on most issues when I was in the state Senate. I'm not sure that that is always there today in the same way that it was 20 years ago. And I think that's too bad because, the fact is it's one thing to take partisan positions at election time. That's important to our political process. But we need to be able to put those issues aside once the elections are over and work together to address the issues facing New Hampshire, facing the country. And to the extent that we are hindered in doing that, it means that it's difficult to solve the challenges that we face.
What do you think, Senator Gregg?
Well, I think the political climate moves in cycles. And right now we're in a national cycle. And we have been really since 9/11. And I think, and now because of the concern about the economy, you've got this very serious issue of sovereign debt that's affecting all the Western economies and Japan. And I think you're seeing a lot of national issues take the forefront. I believe, though, that it will cycle back, as it almost always does. And at some point, maybe in the next election cycle, you'll have more the issues will be more state-oriented as versus national. So I do think you go through these periods. I would say this, there are always going to be very significant differences on the issues. That's why you have different parties. That's why you have different philosophies in government. You're supposed to have these differences. And the question is, are you able to still govern in a way that has everybody at the table recognizing that there are going to be strong differences? The person I most respected in the Senate probably had the strongest opinions and was furthest from me on almost all the issues, and that was Ted Kennedy. But he understood that even though we had deeply different positions, and he was chairman of the committee and I was chairman of the committee, and we exchanged chairmanships of the same committee, we still knew we had to legislate to accomplish anything. And so things like No Child Left Behind, which was he and I working on the Senate side, and John Boehner and George Miller on the House side, we recognized the need to do that. And so you can have these very strong views, and you don't have to give up your philosophical base in order to govern in a way that reaches across the aisle. You can govern and still maintain your philosophical base and still reach across the aisle, I think.
Is there, you mentioned Senator Kennedy, is there a generational aspect to this? To you, I think first Senator Gregg, but Senator Shaheen, you as well. Are younger people raised on cable TV, on more of a gotcha media culture? Are they just more comfortable with this sort of headbanging partisanship that older people may see as uncivil?
Well, that's a really excellent question, and I don't know the answer to it. That's going to be a good question. How does the next generation interface with the political system when so much of their lifestyle is passive relative to the political system? In other words, they're getting the information from the internet. They're not participating by going to a meeting or working a street or putting up a sign. It's an entirely different structure of political involvement now than what I came up through. I suspect what Gene came up through. And so it will be interesting to see how that does change the system. But I think it will have a change. I just don't know that it changes.
What do you think, Senator Shaheen? Generational?
Well, certainly my 24-year-old daughter is much more comfortable reading the blogs, and she always gets her news from reading the internet than from reading a newspaper. But I think the encouraging news is that as we look at young people's participation in politics, and when I was at the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, we looked at this a lot. And if you track from 1972, which was the first presidential election where 18-year-olds had the right to vote, to 2004, there was a steady decline in voting on the part of young people. But in 2004, that began to change, and there was an increase in 04, 06, and then in 08, where we really saw young people participating in greater numbers than ever before. So who knows what we'll see this midterm cycle, but hopefully young people will continue to participate because they'll recognize the impact that the political process has had on their lives. And in tracking what changed about their participation in 04, there were several things. One is they remembered September 11th and felt a real personal impact as the result of those events. They were concerned about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that was part of what engaged young people. So, and in 2008 we saw concern about the economy and what was happening. So hopefully they will continue to stay engaged.
Well, one more generational question. It's kind of like music. I mean, older people never like that music of a younger generation. I mean, is this just a morphing, Senator Shaheen, of a new political culture, or is this really a problem?
I don't think we know yet. I think if we have generations of young people who are not engaged in the political process, that's a problem, because our democracy only works if we're all engaged in it. But if they continue to be more engaged, then that's a positive sign.
What do you think? I know you said earlier, Senator Gregg, it's hard to answer.
Well, I think every generation looks back on the coming generation and thinks that they're not as competent as theirs. Henry Adams wrote a wonderful history of America where he just tormented the younger generation as compared with his, and that was in the late 1800s. So I think it's natural, because we came through one experience. They're coming through an entirely different experience from the standpoint of how they engage in the political process. But I think Jean's right. I think the engagement is there. It's just a question of how it's going to manifest itself. One of my concerns is it's getting more and more difficult to get really talented people to run for public office, primarily because both parents have to work now, and you also have an atmosphere out there where, because of the national debate has become so intense and so difficult, a lot of people just don't want to do it. So that's a big issue, and hopefully we don't know the answer, as Jean said, as to whether or not we're going to see the type of engagement you need. But you need really a large reservoir of good people coming into the political system, the elective political system, if you're going to have good governance.
Well, I definitely want to ask you about the candidates. I also want to remind our live audience here that if you have a question for the senators, go ahead and fill out a card, and we'll try to collect that to you and weave it into our conversation as best we can. So don't be shy. Go ahead and hand your cards to one of our staff members there. Let's talk about the elections and the candidates. I'm glad you mentioned that, Senator Gregg. National Endowment for the Humanities Chairman Jim Leach, as you probably know, has kicked off a nationwide civility tour. He began it proudly here in New Hampshire last year. He says that while America is what he calls a pragmatic, centrist nation, our elective processes don't reflect that, with low primary turnouts, gerrymandered districts that produce candidates who are either very right or very left. Senator Shaheen, how much do you see that trend of the candidates that Senator Gregg mentioned becoming more in their own ideological corners?
Well, I don't just see it, it's well documented. And if you look at the way our political process has worked, the primary system has produced people who tend to be further on either end of the spectrum. And it has happened because we have gerrymandered districts. So we have safe Democratic districts in a lot of the country and safe Republican districts. And so the fight is on either end of the spectrum. Witness what we're seeing in so many Senate races now. And in Arkansas, the primary fight that Blanche Lincoln has, in Pennsylvania between Arlen Specter and Joe Sestak. We're seeing those kind of primary battles here in New Hampshire, too, as a matter of fact. So I think that has been a problem, and what it's produced is people who sometimes, I think, find it harder to negotiate in the middle. Because, as Judd said, we've got to keep people at the table. We've got to be able to reach some sort of compromise if we're going to legislate. And if you've got people who are so far apart that they can't reach a compromise, then you can't legislate.
So we're seeing that now. You're seeing that now.
I think we are.
What do you think, Senator Gregg?
Well,
our process.
I think Jean's absolutely right.
Sets this up.
It's a function, in large part, in the House of Representatives of the districting situation, where you, I don't know, it's like 85% of the seats are now safe. By safe, that means if you get the nomination in your primary, you're going to win the seat, and that means that in the primary is where the battle is. And of course, the primary vote is always much smaller, and it's much more motivated, and it's from the base, as they say, either the left or the right. And so your candidate that's going to be elected in many instances is going to be very much reflective of that those viewpoints, which are not what it takes to win the general election, but you don't have to worry about winning the general election under that scenario. I think the Senate's a little different. I mean, we are seeing the challenges in the Senate, but ironically, the Senate's the place where people still get elected, have to win the general election almost everywhere. I mean, there are a few states where the general election isn't that much in play, but very, very few when it comes to the Senate. So the Senate still, you have to be able to speak to the independent vote, and hopefully the general public, specifically not only your party, but the independent and some of the other party, in order to be successful in a Senate race. That's why the Senate, I think, tends to be a much more, well, there are a lot of reasons why the Senate tends to be a little more oriented towards substantive policy, but that's certainly one of them.
Here's a question from our audience. We talk about hyper-partisanship today. This person says, is partisanship stronger today? And if so, why? Senator Shaheen, I would add on to that. And is that a problem? I mean, the parties help us define who we are and what we believe.
Well, as I said, I don't think the partisanship is a problem if that's the perspective people always have. So I think you have to run elections, but the problem is when you get by elections, if partisanship governs everything that you're working on. And one of the places where I'm not sure that Judd and I agree is on the rules of the Senate. As a newbie, I'm less committed to some of those rules, but I think we've got to look at the rules of the Senate and see how they have contributed to obstructionism in the Senate and to some of that partisanship. I think it's important for us to protect minority rights, but I think allowing one person to filibuster and hold up indefinitely legislation that comes before the Senate is not a system that makes sense. I think the fact that we can, without saying who we are, hold somebody who's been nominated by the president indefinitely, not because we have a concern about that person, but because we have another issue that we're trying to get somebody's attention to. I think that doesn't make sense. Right now we have over 80 of the president's nominees on hold, and at this point in the Bush administration there were 8 on hold. So I think that kind of rules contributes to partisanship in some respects.
What do you think, Senator Gregg?
Oh, I think the Senate's an incredibly unique body that has evolved over time, and its constitutional purpose, as defined by Washington, was to be the saucer into which the hot coffee is poured. We are a government. Our constitutional government was structured to be incremental. We're not a parliamentary government. A parliamentary government moves very quickly left or right, depending on which party wins the majority, because there are no limitations. There's no checks and balances. Our government was built by Madison with massive checks and balances. And the biggest check and balance in our governmental system is the Senate. And I'm a great protector and defender of the prerogative of the Senate to act as a supermajority. That's what it's supposed to do. On contentious issues that are significant to the country, there should be something more than a 51-vote event, unless by the terms of the Constitution it's 51 votes, such as, in my opinion, Supreme Court justice can't be filibustered. But the issue is, if you're talking about civility, bipartisanship, compromise, and reaching a consensus, if you require 60 votes, by definition you're going to have to do that, because rarely does one party have 60 votes. I mean, the Democratic Party had 60 votes briefly here, but so I think it's a system that has worked very well for our nation. It keeps the way I described it is all American politics is played between the 40-yard lines. If you go to England, politics you might be down the 20-yard line, on the left or the right, depending who the party is. I think it's best to have politics between the 40-yard lines and not have an overreach, because we are not a nation that has an ideological base that's either left or right. I think we're a center-right nation, but we're center, basically. And you want to be able to maintain a government system that doesn't overreach and therefore affront the electorate and the people who sent you there. And that can happen quickly if you went to a system where you took out the pressure point in the Senate, which is that 60-vote event.
I want to ask both of you about civility in elections. And it's easy for both of you to say we should be civil in elections because Senator Gregg, you're stepping down, and Senator Shaheen, you've got a long way until your next re-election. But put yourself in the shoes of someone who is in a very tight election. Their opponent is making all sorts of accusations, maybe even lying about your record. How do you respond to that in a civil way, Senator Gregg?
Well, I think it depends on the personality of the candidate. Gene's been through some really tough races. I've been through some tough races. I won my first race with 52 votes. I think I got them in Peterborough. Against a well-known, very well-established candidate who's become a very close friend, Bernie Streeter. And I've had a couple of other close races. And they're intense. There is nothing more intense than a political campaign. People who haven't been through political campaigns just can't appreciate how intense that is. I mean, it's an all-consuming event, and it goes on for months and sometimes years, and there is a tremendous amount of accusation that you think is wrong and that wrongs you, and certainly if they bring your family into it, it's extremely agitating. But I think the personality of the candidate defines whether or not you get carried away in your response. And I've never seen Gene carried away. I think she just represents a very measured, thoughtful, and appropriate way to campaign. Hopefully I've done that in my career. But again, I think it's the character of New Hampshire that most candidates in New Hampshire that seem to be successful come from the school that you try to be pleasant and civil even if you're being attacked inappropriately and unfairly.
Well, and here's a question related to that from our audience. So I'll give this to you, Senator Shaheen. This person says, not only must debate be civil, it must be accurate or you lose your credibility. Agree, question mark. And then the second part, if so, why are so many politicians so loose with the facts?
Well, as Judd says, I've always tried to be civil, and I've tried not to get personal but I think somebody's record is fair game. And we see negative attack ads because they work, frankly. And unfortunately, sometimes if there is not a robust press corps who has the ability to check the facts, it's very hard to get a message out if your opponent mischaracterizes what your record has been or what your positions are on issues. So it really, our system of democracy relies on a strong two-party system, but it also relies on a very strong press corps. And one of the things that's happening sadly in this country right now is we're losing a lot of that independent press corps with newspapers that have been under assault because they can't compete with the electronic media, with radio stations that are no longer local. They're bought up by national chains. And so that's, I think, a real challenge as we look at the future.
Right. So everyone runs negative ads. Maybe you don't want to call them attack ads. So, Senator Gregg, if you want to have civility, and I hear both of you feeling committed to civil dialogue, and yet you're being attacked and attacked and attacked, do you take the high road even if you lose, or what do you do?
Oh, no. Your basic goal is to respond. And if they're inaccurately presenting your position, you present it accurately and then take it to the next level, which is to present their position, hopefully accurately, but also in juxtaposition to yours, showing the difference and why your position is a better one, and hopefully people will vote for you. That doesn't require you to be obnoxious or over the top or vicious. It just requires a concise, and we always, in my campaigns, we always try to do it with humor, actually, because I always thought it was more effective if you could cast your opponent's view when he was or she was attacking you inappropriately with some humorous response that made the point you wanted to make while moving on to the point you were trying to score points against that candidate with. But you can also do it with very aggressive ads. And there's nothing wrong with aggressive ads as long as they're factually accurate and they don't personalize in a way that's inappropriate. But aggressive ads are critical, as Gene said. People react.
Some of the most aggressive ads that we've seen in recent years, and I have noticed an increase, and I know you have too, is not even from candidates like you, but outside groups ranging from the Sierra Club to the National Rifle Association. What's the role, Senator Shaheen, of these types of groups in kind of ratcheting up the rhetoric so that they can not only get their candidate elected, but also, raise money? The fundraising letters that you get are sometimes kind of over the top.
Well, they are, and that is another challenge, I think, that we have. The recent Supreme Court decision in Citizens United raises another specter for that we should be concerned about, because it opens the door for corporate contributions in a way that we haven't seen in the past. And there is some legislation that would respond to that would say that if you're the NRA or the Chamber of Commerce or the Sierra Club and you're doing an ad in a state, that you have to abide by the same requirements that the candidates do, so that you have to have paid for by at a certain size logo on the ad, and you have to have the picture of the CEO of that organization. And the idea is that if the CEO from some of those organizations has to have their name and their picture on the ad, that they might be a little more careful about making sure that what's in it is accurate.
Wow. That's an interesting development.
Now, that's legislation that hasn't been passed yet, but it's been proposed.
What do you think, Senator Gregg? What role broadly do these interest groups play in increasing the coarsening of our civic dialogue that some people see?
Oh, very significant. And one of the problems is that most of these groups, you actually don't know who's funding them under the rules. We have to disclose everything. But these groups, these 527s, disclose virtually nothing about where the money comes from, how it's spent, who they hire. And it really is an unfortunate recent evolution of our political system. However, on the other side of the coin, we do have the First Amendment, which is key to our capacity to have a free society. So freedom of speech is absolutely essential. And as the Supreme Court has rightly noted, freedom of speech in our society requires the ability to spend money to do speech, which is essentially why they allowing corporations now to participate in the process, just the way labor unions have for years been able to participate in the process. So it's difficult to rein in these groups. I would like to see more disclosure from these groups, not only on their ads, but actually disclosure as to where they get their money and who they're hiring, and just the way we would have to do it as a candidate. I think that would be healthy if that happened.
It's interesting. Yeah, you really have seen an increase. And sometimes the candidates themselves, Senator Gregg, right, say, please
absolutely
stop
no
this.
Control over it. Bob Corker, who ran in Tennessee and was just recently elected, almost lost his election because an independent group came in and started spending money on his behalf, and they were running an ad which was really a horrible ad. And he got painted with it, and he didn't want the ad run. He wanted it taken off the air, but they wouldn't take it off the air.
Here's a question from our audience, relates to something that you mentioned earlier, Senator Gregg, so I'll give it to you, Senator Shaheen. This person says, from a historical perspective, do you think today's vitriolic political discourse is worse or not as bad as it was in the mid-19th century prior to the Civil War? And Senator Gregg started out telling us that story of Massachusetts Senator Sumner being almost caned to death on the floor of the Senate.
Well, he did, and we've sort of addressed this, I think, in that if we look at particular comments from newspapers at the time. We all learned about yellow journalism when we were in school, and incidents like the caning incident that Judd talked about. We can point to the kind of vitriol that we see today. But I think what makes today different is the issue that we've raised already, which is the 24-hour news cycle and the constant cable television, talk radio replaying of the comments that provide a megaphone that the whole country hears. And I think that's what makes today's lack of civil dialogue much worse than what we saw 100 years ago.
You know, here's an interesting question. We've talked about the responsibility of the media and blogosphere and candidates themselves and so forth, interest groups. But this person says, what is our collective responsibility to hold our leaders accountable in this regard? What do you think, Senator Gregg?
Well, obviously it would be nice if people generally rejected outrageous comments and excessive activity that's uncivil and inappropriate. And I think they do in many places. I think New Hampshire rejects that in our political process. I think if you step over the line in this state, you're probably not going to do very well in an election. But there is still this amplification that's occurring out there, not only in the general media, but I think this blogosphere amplification is even more disruptive to the process, because it is so undisciplined. So undisciplined in what people say and how they amplify what they say, and there is no fact test at all. I mean, if somebody decides to say something about you, it can be totally inaccurate, but it suddenly starts bouncing around the cloud there, and everybody hears it, and but there's no way to control it, obviously. I mean, it's the right of free speech. It's just that the amplification has become so overwhelming.
Well, it's kind of what we talked about earlier, too, Senator Shaheen. If people were really in the streets chanting civil discourse, they wouldn't be tuning into or logging into some of the sources of information we talked about.
Well, I think we have responsibility not just to hold our leaders accountable, but we as individuals have a responsibility to, whenever we're discussing an issue or talking to our friends or our family or writing a letter to the editor or however we're expressing ourselves, to do it in a way that's civil and respectful and that listens to others' points of view. I mean, you can never get agreement on an issue as long as you're talking past each other. At some point, if you're going to get agreement on, whether it's what to do about the zoning board in your local community or how to solve immigration challenges or whatever the challenge is, well, we've got to listen to each other and compromise if we're going to get something done. And the constant talking past each other doesn't allow us to do that.
Well, and I have another question from the audience that uses immigration, actually, Senator Shaheen, as a topic that prompts, this person says, lots of uncivil discourse. This person says this is increasingly true in New Hampshire, too, as the percentage of immigrants and refugees increases. How do we develop civil discourse on this topic? I'd like to ask you more generally, how do we develop civil discourse on topics like this where people do get very passionate? I mean, immigration, abortion, war. I mean, this is areas where it's really hard to listen to the other side and understand.
One of the things that we haven't raised yet in this discussion is the importance of civics in our schools. And when I went to high school, you had to take civics. That's not true today in most schools. And so I think one of the things we've got to do is look back at how we're educating our young people and our kids, and about the need to educate them about the importance of civil discourse and the importance of listening and the importance of being able to engage in a way that doesn't deteriorate into name-calling and finger-pointing.
I have a personal question for both of you. Have either of you in your political careers crossed the line yourself and thought later, I shouldn't have done that? Senator Gregg?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I can't, an instant doesn't come to mind, but I'm sure that
in the heat of the moment,
I may have said, I probably said something that I really regretted saying to someone, and I would hope that I went back and apologized. And not a specific instance doesn't come to mind, but I'm sure that's happened because we're all human,
Right.
And sometimes you just get so into it and so engaged in it that you say something that you shouldn't have said. And if you do, you have to be willing to say to the person, gee, I made a mistake. That was my mistake.
Well, and you wouldn't be involved this long in public life if you didn't care, and that caring makes you sometimes...
Oh, of course. You feel these issues are intensely felt by the candidates and the people who represent you in government. That's why they do it in most instances.
Senator Shaheen, you want to come clean about anything?
You know, you can't have been involved in politics as long as we both have and feel like not have said something at some point, but I don't have a particular instance. But as I said, what I've tried to do is to be respectful, and I think that's important. And if I've slipped, you know, like Judd, hopefully I've apologized for that and moved on.
Is there any trust left between the two major parties, or is that just done?
Oh, no, there's a lot of trust. I mean, the people who govern in Washington understand the need to work across the aisle to get major pieces of legislation through. Right now we're working on something called the Financial Reform Bill, which is incredibly complex. And there's a lot of across-the-aisle work being done on it. It's not turning out that well, but
I'm surprised that
everybody's making an effort.
On.
So no, I think at maybe senior is the wrong term, but at the level of that Jean and I work at, which is in the Senate amongst people who are really very good people. I mean, the people who represent, I'm leaving so I can say this, but the people who represent us in the Senate and in the House are really dedicated people who are interested in making government work better and work well. And almost all of them, at least in the Senate, there's a real willingness to go across the aisle and at least talk, if not actually work, to try to get things done. And sometimes it doesn't work out, like in the health care bill, but in most instances it does. There is ability to find that place where you don't have to give up your principles, but you can make progress.
The end of bipartisanship, Senator Shaheen? Is there a center left anywhere in American politics?
Well, there is, and I think most legislation ultimately gets done in the center. And one of the things that Judd and I do is work very closely together. We don't vote the same way on a lot of things, but we work very closely because that's in the best interests of the people of New Hampshire. And our offices talk on a regular basis. And if I'm working on an issue that I think he's going to be concerned about, we let him know, and I think vice versa. So I think people in New Hampshire are well served when we work closely together in their interest.
We actually have a breakfast. We used to it'll start it up again, but it's a bipartisan breakfast every Tuesday, and there would be probably 20 people would show up, and it was totally bipartisan. It was run by Lamar Alexander and Senator Lieberman, and now there's a bipartisan cheese and crackers event on Thursday afternoon.
That's right.
And people show up, and it's because most people in the Senate understand you really can't get anything done unless you are able to reach across the aisle, because first off, it takes 60 votes, which is a good idea, and secondly, the vote that's with you today, that's against you today, is the vote you're going to need tomorrow. So you cannot personalize any of these votes, even though you may hold the issue, be really into the issue and take it very intensely. If you personalize a vote, you're finished in the Senate. You just can't do it. You've got to be able to, sort of like a lawyer, take a case and move on.
Now, I know you're biased, but is the House the problem then? Is that what you're saying?
The House is different.
Is that the source of all the rancor? Go ahead,
Senator
Senator
what we
Shaheen.
haven't talked about, though, Laura, and maybe this was different when you started, Judd, but people who have been around the Senate for a long time, or the House, tell me that it used to be that people moved their families to Washington, that they socialized together over the weekend, that they didn't fly home every weekend, and they then developed a level of trust and a relationship that made it easier to work together. And I do think that is challenging today because people go home, or most people go home every weekend, and so you don't develop a relationship in the same way that they used to do. And I would say that one of the positive things about the Senate that I like is the fact that the women senators get together 4 times a year, Republican and Democrat. We get together for dinner, and we have great conversations, and it's really, I think, added to our ability to work together.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall in those conversations. It's interesting what you say about people not hanging around in Washington. People say that in New Hampshire, too, about when the old highway... Was it the Highway Hotel?
Yes. Hotel, sure.
When that closed, they paint pictures of Republicans and Democratic lawmakers drinking and sitting around the piano and becoming friends. Do you see that, Senator Gregg, what Senator Shaheen talks about? People do go home. There's that responsibility to show your face in the home state, but that degrades the quality of friendships that you have within the Beltway.
I think that's probably true. Certainly in the House it's true. You asked, is the House the problem? No, the House isn't the problem. The House is just an entirely different institution because the majority in the House has autocratic control. They can do anything they want because they have a rules committee. And the rule, you could take a bill to the floor of the House, the most complicated bill in the world, the most difficult bill in the world, and they can pass a rule that says we'll debate it for an hour and there'll be no amendments. It's an autocracy over there run by the Speaker, whoever the Speaker is, whether it's a Republican Speaker or a Democratic Speaker. So they have it's an entirely different system. And that's why you need the Senate to be the saucer into which the hot coffee is poured. But the House isn't the problem. It's just institutionally structured differently.
Here's a great last question for you from our audience again. This person says, so, you two are terrific. Are you willing to take your show on the road and educate others about civility?
Well, we'll go to MSNBC and then to Fox.
Yeah.
That's a great question. This special edition of The Exchange is a partnership with the Live Free or Die Alliance, committed to providing New Hampshire citizens with objective information about issues and candidates. Find out more at livefreeordiealliance.com. The Exchange is a production of New Hampshire Public Radio. The engineer is Dan Colgan. The producer is Dan Ankeles. Our intern is Sarah Crane. Thanks to Abby Goldstein for editorial assistance and technical support from Mike Saffel, Andrew Perella, Dan Colgan, Steve Bothwick, Nathan Chervik, and Nick Wolos. The Exchange's executive producer is Keith Shields, and I'm Laura Kanoy. And thanks again to Senator Gregg and Senator Shaheen for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.